From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, this is From the South, and I am Sweeney Gray. At least 3 protesters have reportedly been shot dead and multiple others wounded as violence continues to flare in the Zimbabwean capital of Harare. Soldiers have stepped in to disperse protests over this week's presidential election. Reports indicate that at least 1 person was shot dead by the soldiers near a bus rank. Zimbabwe's Justice Minister Zayambi said the army was deployed on the streets of Harare on Wednesday to disperse a violent crowd and to restore peace and tranquility. At first, crowds made fires in the center of the capital, blocking some streets and engaging in running battles with police, who fired a water cannon and tear gas to disperse the protesters. Soldiers then arrived at the scene, jumping out of several armored personnel carriers. Gunfire was heard and an army helicopter flew in the skies above Harare. The Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, the ZEC, has announced 110 seats for Zanu-PF so far and 41 for the MDC alliance. ZBC state media reported there are 210 seats in the National Assembly's lower house. The result of the presidential vote is expected later on Wednesday. The opposition, the Movement of Democratic Change, or MDC, have cried foul and said the polls have been rigged. They had been claiming victory in the polls long before the votes were counted. Meanwhile, Nelson Chamisa took to Twitter to say, "Thank you, Zimbabwe. I'm humbled by the support you've given to me as a presidential candidate. We have won the popular vote. You voted for total change in this past election. We have won this one together. No amount of result manipulation will alter your will." And President Emerson Mnangagwa tweeted out a call for peace. He said, "At this crucial time, I call on everyone to desist from provocative declarations and statements. We must all demonstrate patience and maturity and act in a way that puts our people and their safety first. Now is the time for responsibility and above all peace." Meanwhile, a senior official from the MDC revealed that an application has been made to the courts to force the Electoral Commission to publish the results of Monday's election. Tendai Biti from the MDC said that some election results were supposed to have been posted outside voting stations, but were not available. Meanwhile, the Electoral Commission urged people to be patient while it continued counting. And earlier, I spoke to Charlton Sozo. He has a PhD in international development and human rights. He was in Harare during this morning's protest and explained why tensions are simmering there. Now, Charlton, what exactly is at contention here?
Well, the thing is, this did not start now. This has been going on for a while, because one of the main areas of contestations has been creating an enabling environment for free, fair, and credible elections. So when the new president came in after the coup last year, he promised that this is something that he was going to do. And one of the main issues that has been running with all this time has been the issue of peace. Yeah, but then there have been problems actually with the electoral laws themselves. So for a long time, civil society activists and opposition, they've been clamoring for reforms around electoral laws, because electoral laws were favoring the ruling party, especially in the days of the Mugabe regime, since independence pretty much. And so I think the ruling party then got on to after a couple of years, from about 2000, when Zimbabwe started having its strongest and perhaps most viable opposition, what then happened was the laws became more and more stringent, as it were, and things like that. So opposition has been clamoring for opening up of media space. It's been clamoring for free coverage as well on state media, and also protection of human rights around elections, and then also just the independence of the Electoral Commission. So these are issues that have been contested all this time, and it has been no different, particularly now. We are actually arguing that this Electoral Commission could be one of the worst since independence. independence, pretty much. And ironically, it's being headed by a justice of the law. So these have been some of the main contestations that have been there. If you look at, because we just moved to a biometric voters roll, pretty much, and then it got messed up. It was worse than the last time when we're using the one that we had the last time, and so people have been, I think there's been so much noise and people have been complaining and demonstrating against the voters roll that was shambolic, and the nomination process, even voting itself, now the allegations of rigging as well, because, the environment is not. Yeah.
You mentioned rigging. How does this end, in the courts or another presidential term where people believe the voice of the public has not been heard?
Well, ideally, the courts are supposed to deal with any sort of irregularities with regards to, to the electoral process itself. But there are also conversations. We've been in contestations around partiality of the courts themselves, because the argument is that the courts are even captured themselves as well. So if they're not able to deliver a flawless process or a credible process, how then do you get to, adjudicate when we have contestations like in this particular case? So all that is questionable at the moment.
A closed-door meeting between the Colombian government and the ELN, or National Liberation Army, has ended in Havana, Cuba. The two main issues discussed in the 5th and 6th cycles have been a new bilateral and nationwide ceasefire and a proposal for how civil society can participate in the building of peace. A statement read out at the news conference said that on both issues much had been achieved.
The two main topics that we have discussed are a new temporary bilateral ceasefire and a blueprint for society's participation in the construction of peace. We have made progress on both topics with the assistance of various social organizations from many different regions of Colombia.
And Laura Prada has more from Havana.
Today ended up here in Havana the 6th cycle of dialogues between the Colombian government and the guerrilla National Liberation Army, ELN, with no full agreements on a bilateral ceasefire. Even though they made important, significant advances in their dialogue, but they did not reach to any full agreement.
Thank you, Laura Prada, for that report. And we'll take a short break, so join us again after this look at what our multimedia colleagues are reporting. Welcome back. WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange's health has apparently worsened, and he may be forced to leave the building to seek medical attention. The Courage Foundation, a group that raises funds for Assange's legal defense, said he is confined to a small space and has no access to sunlight. The group pointed out that such conditions pose a serious impact to his physical and mental health. A federal judge has extended an order preventing the eviction of hundreds of Puerto Rican families who fled the hurricane-ravaged island in 2017 and have been living in motels across the United States. Judge Hillman extended the order to allow the government time to respond to new arguments raised by lawyers representing evacuees over FEMA's inadequate response to the crisis. Hurricane Maria caused an estimated $90 billion in damage to the already economically struggling U.S. territory. And sex tapes are not new, but in the Caribbean, the consequences for a woman when a tape enters the public sphere can be quite costly. Shame is magnified when living in a small country, and escaping public condemnation can be very difficult. We spoke to one woman who's going through a very public scandal right now to find out how she's coping. Christy Adia woke up to a nightmare. Her social media accounts had become the target of people condemning a video she made privately with a partner that was released in the public without her consent.
How I'm feeling now is very betrayed and ashamed, embarrassed. It's just so much emotions that it's very hard to get it out.
Chrissy's partner, seen in the video, is the reggae artist Jabami, real name Marvin Walters. Chrissy issued a statement on social media saying Jabami used a moment of intimacy to shame and cyberbully her. Jabami later shared that statement saying that it would be crazy for him to share a video that could be seen by his wife and teenage daughters.
Who want to smoke, baby? Who?
Who want to smoke?
Joke. Joke.
When sex tapes are released, most often, it is the woman who faces the brunt of the public condemnation. To explain why, we turn to Dr. Suan Barrett, a gender and communications lecturer at the University of the West Indies.
The idea is that sex is taboo as the ultimate presumption, one, and two, that women should indeed be passive. If you are then seen in a sex tape, the notion of who is breaching the taboo will always rest in the woman.
Dr. Barrett describes the online bias against women as an example of femininity as failed because the rules of being a good and decent woman are very strict. She likens those online behaviors to being a form of gender-based violence, as she writes about in an April paper looking at two similar cases in Trinidad.
Because we do embrace a notion of, I will be an acceptable human based on ideology of gender if I'm decent. If as a young woman, my legs are closed, I'm not a thought or a whore, whatever words are there. So even women will reinforce this thing, well, if you didn't want people to see your tape or your picture or whatever, even though it was the privacy of your own home or your own space, then don't do it. But that is part of a discourse of personal responsibility that's extremely sexist and aggressive against femininity, because femininity then is constructed as failure.
As for the women in the situation, they often have to find healing in an often unforgiving space. But Christy says she has support and she's determined to rise above this.
I just want to take control back of my life because I was independent and well, had stuff going on for me before we got in this situation, and I want that same thing back after the situation. Like, I need to get back my independence and take control of my life moving forward with this.
Clashes broke out in the capital city of Chile as student protesters took to the streets to voice their opposition to the conservative government's youth labor law. Demonstrators say the proposal will limit their opportunities to enter the workforce in search of full-time employment as they try to launch their career. The proposal presented by President Sebastian Pinera sanctions work for students between 18 and 28 with a limit of 30 hours per week. Family and friends of Chileans who went missing during the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet have protested outside the Supreme Court against a recent court decision to release the perpetrators of human rights crimes in the Pinochet area. On July 30th, the court ruled to release 5 people who had been found guilty of human rights crimes and jailed at the Punta Pueco prison on Wednesday. The court ruled to release 2 more. Protesters gathered outside the court holding signs and banners and expressing their outrage.
What we saw yesterday is definitely a political decision to act in favor of impunity in the same way that this judicial power did during the 17 years of the civil military dictatorship. This is extremely serious. We just learned a few minutes ago that 2 more killers have been released. The issue is that in this far-right government, before the inoperation of all previous governments, here they have the chance and they have been shamelessly liberal, so they're genocidal violators of human rights.
Indigenous people from El Salvador have urged the government to respect the national plan for indigenous peoples that they had developed together.
Representatives from the indigenous people of Nahuapipil, Lenca, and Carahuira asked Salvadorian President Salvador Sánchez Serén to respect the final draft of the National Plan for Indigenous People, which has already suffered severe modifications.
When we ask for the autonomy of indigenous people, we should recall that it was because autonomy was taken away from us. We are talking about food safety from our perspective. That was also taken away from us. We want institutions to be stronger in order to collaborate with indigenous people. That relationship was also erased.
After analyzing the final plan proposed by the government, indigenous representatives raised concerns on substantial changes the government made without any consultation.
Al no tomar en cuenta lo que tiene el plan PIE,
if the government does not take action into account the contributions we made to the plan, it will be like stealing the heart of all the indigenous people in El Salvador. We have always had the goodwill to search for peace in our society.
Siempre buscando esa paz en nuestra sociedad.
According to the national census, around 1 million citizens in El Salvador belong to indigenous groups. They represent 17% of the population and want the rights to be respected.
Como pueblos indígenas estamos con la disponibilidad.
We want a mechanism to allow the development of indigenous self-government for the 3 indigenous communities living in El Salvador, so they can be free and informed.
A fin de que las comunidades de los 3 pueblos indígenas de El Salvador puedan ejercer plenamente su derecho.
Indigenous people from El Salvador acknowledge the efforts made by the government, but they regret the modification to the National Plan for Indigenous People. They want a new dialogue to be opened.
Many countries in the English-speaking Caribbean are celebrating Emancipation Day. In Trinidad and Tobago celebrates the day with a reenactment of the reading of the Emancipation Proclamation, followed by a procession through the streets of the capital, Port of Spain. Trinidad and Tobago was the first country to recognize the day as a holiday, celebrating the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, which was in force the following year. On Monday, the leader of government business in the Parliament shared Emancipation Day greetings to the national community.
Madam Speaker, despite our history, I believe now more than ever that whilst cynicism and apathy are choices, hope is the better choice. It is that deep-seated hope that echoed in the Negro spirituals and would later find voice in our own storytellers like the Mighty Sparrow's Slave and Bob Marley's Get Up, Stand Up for Your Rights. Trinidad and Tobago's continued, at times sporadic march forward demands a stubborn optimism that can only come from a place of renewed hope rather than apathetic ennui.
In Jamaica, Prime Minister Andrew Holness sent greetings on the occasion of Emancipation Day, encouraging citizens to never to forget the importance of the day and to forego violence in their society.
Today, inasmuch as we celebrate the beginning of our freedom from enslavement, we are also celebrating the end of the violent system that oppressed our forefathers. We must never forget that. Not as motivation to hate, but as a reminder to love and respect ourselves. You know, the enslavers dehumanized our forefathers as chattel, property, not entitled to love or dignity or the inviolability of their physical being, in order to justify the use of violence on them. Unfortunately, we are seeing an emerging culture that dehumanize and objectify our people and devalue their life. There's a growing lack of respect for the inviolability and sanctity of the physical human form and the right to life. This creates a permissible attitude to wantonly use violence against each other in our society.
And in Barbados, the celebrations took the form of a traditional blessing in front of the Emancipation statue in Bridgetown. The statue is commonly called the Buster statue, which is the name of the man who started a slavery revolt in Barbados in 1816.
Just over 200 years ago, this man, this human being, this African man was involved in the struggle for the liberation of our people, in which all of you must be included. You have a historic mission, just as well as I do, to fulfill that trust that he has vested in you.
There was also a demonstration in London from Brixton to Parliament Square called the African Emancipation Day March, calling for reparations for the victims of the African slave trade. Marchers walked with a petition which said, quote, "The blood, sweat and tears of our ancestors financed the economic expansion of the United Kingdom." The march will end at Windrush Square after the petition has been delivered. And some good news for Ecuadorian medicine. Ecuadorian doctors have done the first bipulmonary transplant surgery and saved a woman's life. It is the first lung transplant at the highest altitude in history.
For the first time in Ecuador, the Carlos Andrade Marine Hospital performed the first pulmonary transplant, which saved the life of a 30-year-old mother.
It's a program that is open not only for state insurance patients, but for all Ecuadorians. If a patient is diagnosed with chronic respiratory failure anywhere in Ecuador and is validated by the medical doctor, they send him here.
The procedure lasted for 14 hours with a team of more than 50 medical professionals.
In Latin America, they only transplant one lung. We can also do that, but we chose the hardest way, transplant 2 lungs in the first surgery.
For Karina's relatives, the surgical intervention was a miracle.
The decision was my wife's. It depended on her. She's a warrior. I want her to have a normal life because we deserve it. We had fought a lot, and now, thanks to this team of doctors, friends, and family, we are here.
This year, Ecuador has completed 59 successful transplants. Ecuador now becomes the 6th country in South America to perform a lung transplant, which Quito's altitude is also one of the highest transplants ever done. Denise Herrera, Telesur Quito, Ecuador.
We'll take a short break now, but join us again after this look at what our multimedia colleagues are reporting. Welcome back. Thousands of people have greeted the opposition leader Jean-Pierre Bemba as he returned to the Democratic Republic of Congo to submit his candidacy for December's presidential election. Bemba, a former vice president whose war crime convictions at the International Criminal Court in The Hague were quashed on appeal in May, is expected to pose a challenge to President Joseph Kabila.
Joseph Kabila's clan thought we were living in a kingdom, that if a president dies, his son replaces him, and if a priest dies, his son will replace him. That's over now, because Jean-Pierre Bemba is here now. That's over. He is our president.
A coalition of 18 out of the 23 presidential candidates in Mali have issued a joint statement denouncing irregularities during the presidential poll last Sunday. 15 of the opposition candidates have demanded that the government investigate what they say was fraud. There were reports of armed attack and problems with the distribution of voting cards. A ruling party politician in India has said that Rohingya refugees in the country are like, quote, pests and should be shot dead. The Bharatiya Janata Dal Party member Raja Singh said Rohingyas are a threat to the nation and should be returned to Bangladesh. There are 40,000 Rohingyas in India. The Hindu nationalist ruling party has been widely criticized for its anti-Muslim stance. Protesters have gathered in Copenhagen, Denmark, to march against a new law which bans face veils. The protesters wore masks, costumes and niqabs covering their faces to protest the law which comes into force today. Denmark's parliament enacted the ban in May, joining France in a face veil ban. And now it's time to take a look at more news from around the world.
The people of Bahrain have taken to the streets to demonstrate against the government's imprisonment of activists and opposition leaders. They specifically marched in solidarity with Hassan Mushaim, whose health is at risk after being deprived of medication. During the march, people called for the downfall of the government and condemned their actions. Protests against the Iraqi government for the lack of basic services have resumed in Basra. People are urging the government to step up and put an end to the water shortage and provide electricity. Protests against the government have been ongoing due to a number of shortfalls in government policy to resolve the high unemployment rates and economic hardships.
Our government only considers its own interests. Can you imagine? As in Basra, our water has been cut off. Basra is meant to be Iraq's food basket. Now people of Basra resort to Iran so as to buy onions at the same price. And Basra is ready for agriculture, from Al-Faw to Baghdad. We have previously asked the Prime Minister to build a dam on Iraq's territories. And then one minister emerges and advocates negotiating the construction of a dam on Ras al-Besha with Iran.
Tommy Robinson, a far-right activist and founder of the Islamophobic English Defence League, was released from a 13-month prison sentence after an appeal. He was jailed for contempt of court and breaching a previous suspended sentence.
And we've come to the end of this news brief. For these and many other stories, you can find them on our website at telusyourtv.net/English. You should also join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. For Tell Us Your English, I'm Sonie Gray. Thank you for watching.
The ruling world order has always subjugated the masses. But who are the actors behind every move? What are their real interests?